Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Hakumei in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 25, Part 2, Signal. The sun hadn't even risen when the two figures approached. Both were almost impossible to distinguish in the darkness, other than that one was tall, the other short, possibly his wife. It was too dark to see either their clothes or their faces. The morning mist swirled a little as they walked. Both walked with a determined and steady step, not like most travelers who were caught out after dark. Finally, they reached their destination, Konoha. The city was completely silent at that early hour, and the large imposing doors rose up through the mists to greet the two travelers. Neither seemed too intimidated by or even interested in the size or the atmosphere of the doors. They continued towards them with pausing or hesitating. The doors were both firmly closed until at least 6, when the latecomers would come to get seats for the Chunin exam finals. Both figures stopped right at the doors. The taller one leaned over and said something to the shorter, who didn't seem to respond. For a moment, nothing happened, but then one of the doors opened slightly, and a young man with a tired and irritated face looked through the small crack and glowered at the two figures. "I'm sorry, but you're going to have to wait until the doors officially." The Uchiha on guard began, but he trailed off and slowly stepped aside as the two passed, neither so much as looking at him. Once they were both gone and out of sight along the roads, the guard shook his head and looked at the slightly opened door in a confused way. "I sure hope no one gets wind of this," he muttered, sleeping on duty and the wind getting the door opened. "Akira must not have locked it. Hokage-sama would have killed me for not noticing it. Good thing no one's come in." As he closed the door and locked it, the sun began the rise, slowly staining the clouds blood red. The dawn had arrived. Niji was the first to wake up. He opened one eye and looked around at the sleeping figures around him. No one even twitched. Heaving a small sigh, Niji sat up and crept out of the hotel room. They needed their sleep. Even Gaara had been knocked out so that he wouldn't lose control that day. Everything had been painstakingly prepared for. Even Zabuza had a place in the plan. Niji smirked at that thought. It was actually kind of funny in a sick way. Everything was going perfectly. Naturally, Sasuke and he had both been nervous about that, but it seemed that their worries were being misplaced. There hadn't been anything to complain about. Even Naruto's little arrest had blown over without much of anything happening. Niji was thinking about going to the ramen place that Naruto was always raving about for breakfast, just so that he could see what all the fuss was about. Secretly, Niji thought that the only reason he was so loyal to it was because the two had been decent to him. To Niji, all ramen tasted the same, other than the individual flavors. Maybe it would be better not to talk about it. Well, there were always other stores that were open at this time. He didn't worry about the others missing him. They would know where he was. That was the strange thing about them. They always had a good idea where everyone would be. Maybe they just knew each other too well. The sun was just starting to rise as Niji walked down the all but deserted street. It was pleasant to walk around when no one was around other than the ever-present route members that just got on your nerves. At least he could half pretend that they weren't there. Niji could get something to eat and enjoy the peace and quiet. "Hello, my eternal rival." Niji whirled around to see the green-clad Rock Lee, dashing towards him and waving frantically at him. Lee dashed past him and ran backwards until he was right beside Niji, who was wishing that Lee had just kept running. "Hello, Lee," Niji said, trying not to sound as unsure of the situation as he was. "What are you doing on this youthful morning?" Lee asked, happily. "Guy-sensei told me that it was best to run 100 times around Konoha for my training to be a ninja. Would you like to join me?" "Youthful? I'd better not," Niji said. "I need to save my energy for the finals, but, didn't you say that you weren't a ninja when we met?" Maybe that would get him on another train of thought that didn't involve some seemingly impossible exercise routine that would probably kill him to try. Niji had been right. Lee's expression changed completely. He was suddenly much more serious. He looked around as if what he was saying was some kind of top-level secret, and, from Niji's limited knowledge of the way things were now in Konoha, it might have been. "No, I'm not officially a ninja," Lee nodded. "Please, Haru, as my eternal rival, you have to keep this a secret. Promise me that should you tell, you will lose the spring of your youth. I promise. Niji muttered, promising himself to tell the others about this guy the second that he could. Naruto would get a kick out of it. Lee nodded, as if that ridiculous vow was more than enough to convince him that Niji wouldn't tell anyone. Maybe to him it was. I was not permitted to be a shinobi because I cannot properly channel chakra, Lee began. Because of this the Chunin teachers would not accept me, but that did not deter me, my eternal rival. In secret I continued to train every day in hopes that I could pass the genin exam despite my handicap, yet no Chunin would even stop to see if I was worthy. Then, 3 years ago, I was training alone, when Guy-sensei found me. Guy-sensei? Niji asked, remembering a guy from Kainan. He is amazing, Haru. Lee's eyes almost had stars in them as he spoke. He came up to me and asked me why I wasn't at class, and I said that I wasn't allowed. He was furious and promised that he would help to train me personally until I was acknowledged. If I was not a genius by birth, he would make me into a genius of hard work. Lee struck up a pose and gave Niji the thumbs up, with his teeth actually flashing at him. Don't worry, my eternal rival. One day we shall fight together and celebrate the glory of our youth. Niji blinked, realizing that he was supposed to say something to that story. So that would mean that you specialize in taijutsu, Niji said thoughtfully. Kimimaro would slaughter him, with such a focus on it. I'm sure that you're better than most would be. You could say that I specialize in taijutsu as well. Also, Guy, as he remembered, was one of the most talented taijutsu specialists in the world. If he had taken an interest in Lee, then Lee must have been a more talented person than Niji gave him credit for. He would have to actually take him seriously if they went up against one another. That was, unless Lee would join Guy in Kainan. That, from the sound of how Lee obviously practically worshipped Guy, was a real possibility. Lee's eyes were practically burning up as he looked at Niji. Yosh. I have decided to become the great taijutsu specialist in Konoha. If you too are a taijutsu specialist, then the fact that we are eternal rivals was truly meant to be. This sounded a little disgusting for Niji, and he started to think up a way to get out of this very strange situation. Well, I guess I'll go for my breakfast. You enjoy your run. Yosh. The flames of youth burn brightly in both of us. Until next time, my eternal rival. Lee called before dashing off. Niji watched him go, not saying anything, and resumed his walk. Niji didn't remember much about Konoha. He had only been 7 when they left, but something told him that Lee's story would have been different. There was no reason why someone who had special needs would be denied training. The only thing that came into Niji's mind was a factory that was producing ninja as quickly as it could for some reason that he could only speculate on. But a factory would have identical products, and ninja couldn't be identical. Ninja had to be what people expected least. Predictable ninja got killed. Lee had the potential to be extremely unpredictable, almost as much as Naruto, the world's most unpredictable person. So, Konoha wasn't going to waste the time that it would take to make strong ninja, each with their own skills and weaknesses. It was going to create a mass of trained fighters. That meant that Konoha didn't care if you got killed. It was sort of like how Sai had described Root, where you don't even have a name. While too much individualism might lead to anarchy, not enough led to a true machine. So, this was why Guy had joined. Because he saw that Danzu saw people's lives as expendable. He saw people like shogi pieces. If a sacrifice was needed, he would do it, and Guy was, while apparently weirder than fiction, not a person who seemed to want to see the death of others. A genius of hard work, eh? Niji thought with a small smile. He supposed he was going to see soon just what someone like that was even capable of. After all, this was the day that they made their gamble. Niji made it to a small restaurant that sold some meat buns that he kind of liked a long time ago. He had once gone there with his father. Niji blinked at that thought. It was strange. At one time, all Niji had thought about was his father and how he was going to avenge him. Somewhere in the past years, his memories had calmed down. Yes, Niji missed his father, and he still harbored a grudge against his uncle for what he had done, but it wasn't the most important thing anymore. His father would have wanted him not to spend his life in bitterness, but to surpass the main family. Niji was no longer a caged bird, both he and his cousin had left their cages a long time ago. "Fancy seeing you here," a tired, irritated voice said. Niji looked up to see Tenten, and made a gesture for her to sit down. She remained standing. Niji shrugged and took a bite out of his meat bun. "Ohio, Tenten-san," Niji said, sounding disinterested, "if you don't want to sit down, fine, but don't stand there glaring over me as if I've committing some kind of crime by eating this meat bun." Tenten grumbled and sat down across from him, looking like she wasn't really sure why she was even doing this. "I hope that I didn't injure you too much in the fight," Niji said, and, realizing that this probably would sound arrogant to her, added, "though you look like you could handle more than I gave you." Tenten looked at him skeptically. "You really think that I'm a good fighter? As good as any guy you've fought?" she asked. "You're better than some and worse than others," Niji shrugged. "If I called you the best I've fought I would be lying to make you feel better, but you're far from the weakest. If you adapted your style, you would be very formidable." "What do you mean, adapted my style?" Tenten asked. This didn't seem to be the answer that she was looking for. "Why did I lose to you? Your fighting style is made to fight against an opponent who, like most short-range fighters, doesn't have much defense against long-range attacks, but if you go against someone who is also long-range or who had developed a defense against long-range attacks, you will lose," Niji said, taking another bite. "The reason that I defeated you was because I know a jutsu that will protect me from flying projectile weapons. But my stepmother says that using an elemental jutsu is cheating." Tenten muttered, then, probably realizing that that sounded kind of foolish, she blushed and looked away. "Then enforce your weapons with chakra," Niji said. "A weapon with some kind of power behind them will usually go through a jutsu that was done under the idea that it's just a normal weapon. Rather like what the famous female of the Sunin, Tsunade, does. Reinforcing her punches with chakra to get more power." Tenten gave him a very suspicious look. "Why would you help me?" she asked. Niji shrugged. "It's a suggestion. Take it or leave it, but I'll tell you this, the way you are, you couldn't hope to beat anyone on my team." Tenten stiffened and glared at Niji. "I promise you, Haru, I'll surpass you," she said calmly. "Then do so, I'll wait for you." Niji smiled a little. "I'll look forward to our rematch." Naruto woke up only to narrowly avoid being clubbed to death by Zabuza's sword. He rolled back and jumped to his feet, 2 kunao in hand already. "What was that for?" Naruto almost yelled. "Wake-up call." Zabuza seemed to be in a cheerful mood. "This is my last day playing nursemaid to you brats, so I decided to celebrate." "By killing me?" Naruto asked, looking around to see if the others had survived the experience. Kimimaro was sitting on the couch, cracking his bones and smiling at Zabuza. That would mean that Zabuza tried but almost was impaled. Haku was looking unhappy and gave Naruto a rueful look. That meant that Haku had gotten surprised and created an ice mirror. Gaara looked just fine. Well, Zabuza wouldn't have been dumb enough to try, right? Hinata and Sakura were also just fine, though looking annoyed. What was it with girls and special treatment? Sasuke was smirking and polishing a kunao. He probably had been waiting for it. Naruto cursed him and all light sleepers. Sai was looking just as annoyed and shocked as Naruto. He had probably thrown a kunao or two, but this wasn't a situation that he was best at. Niji wasn't there at all. He had probably left before Zabuza could do the honors. "If you couldn't dodge it then you deserved to die," Zabuza shrugged. Naruto wished that he could kill him right there. The door opened after a moment and Niji walked in. He looked around at everyone's faces, and an annoyed expression appeared on his face. "I missed something amusing, didn't I?" he asked. "Only Honda-sensei trying to kill us," Hinata sighed. "Well, kill the boys." Niji sighed a little. "I always miss the best parts," he grumbled. "I would have liked to see Masaru flip out. By the way, Taiki, I'd better see some action this time." "Don't worry," Naruto said, turning to face all of them, "we're all going to see action today. We all know our jobs, there's no need to brief ourselves again. Everyone, do your best, and remember, no matter what happens today, if things get too crazy, get out. We're not that good. He who fights and runs away lives to see the light of day," Sasuke recited. "We know, mother." Naruto rolled his eyes. "So, "What are we waiting for?" he said with a grin. "Let's get moving. We have a war to win." The village of Konoha had basically shut down for the exams. Every single shop was closed as the villagers prepared to see the festivities. As most people in the village weren't ninja, it was probably the only time that some of them even saw the people who the village was built to house. Much to most school children's annoyance, the academy was still in session, but it seemed that a great deal of children were sick and had to go to the exams in order to feel better. This was the one event where this kind of behavior was even tolerated. It seemed that Danzo had a good idea of how far he could push people. Naruto found himself on the balcony overlooking the whole scene as the crowds starting to file in. The upper seats were reserved for the more respected VIPs, and from that point the level of importance continued lower and lower in the stadium until if you were extremely unimportant, you might just get killed by a stray kunao. His eyes scanned the crowd, looking for familiar faces. There was Anko. She looked annoyed about something, possibly her boyfriend couldn't come. He got a glimpse of Hayate, looking sick as usual, with the purple-haired woman that Naruto didn't know. He noticed his old landlady, looking older and a little less hateful than she used to. Then again, she wasn't looking at him, so it was hard to tell. It was mostly people that he didn't know, or might have known a long time ago but didn't remember. At last, he saw the two he was looking for. Jiraiya and Tsunade were walking up the stairs towards the VIP section of the seats, close to where the Hokage was supposed to sit. Jiraiya looked like he was talking animatedly to Tsunade, who was ignoring him completely. One of Jiraiya's hands went around Tsunade's waist and she abruptly smacked him, sending him sprawling down some stairs. He stood up, a picture of hurt innocence, and ran up the stairs yelling something at Tsunade. Good, everything was going smoothly. In the last mouth, there hadn't been a lot of communication between them other than 1 or 2 letters updating them on the more important parts of the plan. They hadn't talked at all to Kakashi or the other members. After all, contact would have been seen as strange and even summons might be found out eventually, especially with the wild card of Orochimaru running around loose. The only teacher they had was Zabuza, and he was only interested in getting through this so that he never had to see any of them again, yet even he seemed a little different. Naruto was starting to think that he had a very strange, sick way of showing affection. It usually involved trying to kill them with his giant sword. Maybe that was why only strong people could be around him. There was some movement, and Naruto turned to see Shino and Yumi. Shino bowed a little to the group, but Yumi didn't so much as blink. For all purposes she was going to act like none of them were even there. Naruto understood why Sasuke wanted to beat her so badly. She embodied every bad trait of Sasuke's entire clan and magnified it. What was worse was she wasn't even a real Uchiha. "Ohio, everyone," Shino said, looking around. "Good luck on all your fights." "Ohio," and Dei-chan were the general responses from everyone. Temari and Kankuro, who hadn't even looked up when they arrived, both made noises and turned away to face the arena. They hadn't been talking all that much since they had arrived. Everyone who was supposed to be there was there. Sara was glowering over at Naruto, who was making a show of ignoring him. Kyoko was sitting in an absolutely masculine way, glowering at anyone and everyone. What was that girl's problem? Suddenly there was a burst of noise as fireworks were let off to know that the exams were beginning. Really, this was more of a sporting event than anything else. There were even people walking up and down the stands with food and drinks for the spectators. There was a poof of smoke and the man who seemed to always have a stick in his mouth, Gemma, or something like that, appeared. No, it was Genma. He was looking around at the crowds in a bored kind of way. "Welcome everyone to the exams, participants, come down and show yourselves to the viewers," Genma called, still chewing on his stick. There was a rush of movement as everyone left the balcony that they were using and trooped down the stairs, into the center of the dirt arena. It was the first time in Naruto's life that he had ever stood in front of such a crowd, and as he heard the cheers of excitement, he vowed to himself that he would be here again. It was a rush of excitement that caused his head to grow light. For a child who had been ignored when he was younger, this was heaven. Yes, he had people now, but this was different. This was amazing. "You're getting into this," Sasuke hissed to him. "We're going to be back here one day, all of us," Naruto hissed back, "and then, they're only going to be cheering for us." Still striving for acknowledgement, eh? Sasuke sounded amused. I think I'll help you with that. Just try to make sure that they're chanting your name more than mine. I don't think that I could get the girls to stop, Naruto grinned, looking over at a group of teenage girls who seemed to be busily creating a makeshift sign showing their support for Sasuke. Ah, look, you attract older women too, just like Dash. I thought we agreed to never mention that again. It was a complete mistake on his part, he even apologized. It was dark, he was drunk, and we were hiding out there anyways. Naruto grinned. You two talk too much, Kimimaro muttered, but I have to admit, this is pretty interesting. Just don't do anything weird, Neji muttered. I only do things like that for my opponents, Kimimaro smirked, it's tiring to do things like that anyways. Everyone exchanged looks that doubted that he wouldn't have pulled out his spine if he had thought that he could get away with it. A whole arena squealing in horror and disgust would have been perfectly in his character to try to create. The rules of the exam are simple, you will fight one another in one-on-one matches. Victory will be determined by who is made unable to continue first. However, just because you win or lose the tournament does not guarantee that you will or will not become Chiryunin. You will be judged, not on your fighting ability, but by if and how you exhibit the proper attitude of a Chiryunin. Victory will only guarantee that the judges will have more time to see you, which may raise your chances, Genma explained. So that would mean that everyone here could end up a Chiryunin, Hinata said thoughtfully. It also means that no one could, Kyoko grumbled and cursed a little. She's a bright ray of sunshine, Kimimaro muttered to Neji, who shrugged. There's one in every group, he said. Therefore, you will all be facing off against your predetermined opponents, beginning at when the Hokage and Kazekage give the word. Naruto looked up at the high balcony that he assumed was where the two leaders would sit. They were empty at the moment, but he could see motion that told him that they were about to appear. And two leaders have appeared, Genma smirked as both robed figures stepped into view. Gaara looked up at the figure of the Kazekage with a dead face. Naruto realized that it was the first time in years that he had even seen his father. What was he thinking? Was he happy to see him? Angry? With Gaara's poker face, it was hard to tell, but Naruto had to guess that it was some kind of mix of both of them. Danzo's face as he looked at the small group was completely unreadable, his eyes locked onto each of them in turn, none for a significant amount of time, and then both of them sat down. The crowd went wild at what was apparently the signal to begin. The first match is Uchiha Yumi of Konoha against Masaru, an orphan from Kusa. Everyone else, clear the arena. Genma announced to the crowd, the rules of the individual matches are simple, you fight until the other surrenders, cannot fight anymore or is dead. All weapons and strategies are permitted and there is no time limit. Naruto trudged forwards, looking back at the smirking Sasuke. He seemed confident. Well, he had been working hard to come up with a way to defeat her using speed and only some of his more or less unattached attacks, but Yumi had nothing to hide. He hoped that Sasuke's confidence wasn't arrogance. As everyone else walked off the arena, Sasuke's eyes stayed focused on Yumi. This was it. This was what he had been dreaming of for a month and training like mad for. It was time for Sakura to get her revenge. Are you prepared, Kusunin? Yumi asked, you have time to surrender. I wouldn't surrender if my life depended on it, Sasuke shot back. That's a shame for you, because it does, Yumi looked at him dead on, I intend to kill you, Kusunin. You annoy me, and you have no respect for your betters. I intend to show your village just what becomes of such an arrogant child with no clan and no name. I don't intend to kill you, Uchiha Yumi, Sasuke hissed, I intend to let you live with the shame of losing to a boy with no clan. Then let us begin, Yumi said, her whip in her hands, and see just who is the greater. Down, children, Gemna said calmly, breath for a moment. While I can see you're both looking forwards to this, torturing isn't allowed. But you said that everything was allowed, Yumi pointed out. Those are the official rules. I don't get a thrill out of 12-year-olds torturing one another, so I'm going to stop the fight. Hokage-sama won't care, and most of the VIPs have wives and children who they don't want to introduce to the idea of torture just yet. Weakling, Yumi snarled. Sasuke shrugged. Fine with me. All right, you two, you can start trying to murder each other on my command, Genma said. 1, 2. He spat out his toothpick between the two, and both sprang into action to the roar of the crowds. Sasuke wasn't going to hesitate in speed. He had accidentally shown it during the preliminaries out of anger, and he was going to use that to his best advantage. Sasuke matched Haku in terms of speed, quite a feat, and with speed on his side, he could manage to win without resorting to more powerful and traceable attacks. Sasuke dashed to the side, with Yumi mirroring his actions, throwing a barrage of kunao that was returned by Yumi deflecting to the side. He caught some kind of movement out of the corner of his eyes and jumped back quickly to avoid the path of the tip of Yumi's whip. "Ah, I see you remember my Kinzoku Shiai no Jutsu," Yumi said. "I'm glad you managed to avoid it. It'll make this entire fight much more fun." Sasuke smirked but didn't say anything. He had been training to avoid that technique since Sakura mentioned that there were drugs in it. The last thing that he needed was some kind of hallucinogenic to make him start saying things that he shouldn't. He had enough of a handicap already trying to defeat the little witch without using hand seals or any of his better attacks or even the Sharingan. Still, he didn't need those things. Sasuke dashed on the attack again, avoiding the whip and trying to get close to her. All techniques had a flaw, just as all Kekkei Genkai had some sort of flaw to them. Kimimaro had to drink a tremendous amount of milk, Haku was always cold, Hinata had little offensive power, Niji had a blind spot, the Sharingan couldn't copy certain techniques. Somewhere, Yumi's metal techniques had to have some kind of flaw. And he was going to find the weakness of her technique. Doso tried to keep himself from cringing under the cold, even stare of Kabuto. "I thought that you were going to get them disqualified," Kabuto said softly. "I left the job up to you, but all you did was make a rumor that one of them had been in the shinobi district. Orochimaru-sama wanted them out of the way. He wasn't interested in causing their execution." Kin shrugged. "I don't see why they're so important to Orochimaru-sama," she grumbled. "Because they have exhibited power, and Orochimaru-sama is always interested in those who have power," Kabuto smiled cheerfully. "So he means to recruit them," Doso said thoughtfully. "Had we gotten them disqualified, Orochimaru-sama would have approached them." "I see. You have one chance to redeem yourselves," Kabuto told the trio, "and that is to convince them to help us when the invasion begins. There is no love lost between Kusa and Konoha, and that might work to your advantage. Thankfully, you've reined yourselves in so that you haven't said anything too offensive to them, so maybe you can save your lives." Zuko snarled at Kabuto a little bit. "And just what are you doing, Kabuto?" he asked. "I haven't seen you helping much." "I've been talking to one of our contacts in Konoha, making sure that there was nothing that could go wrong in our plan," Kabuto smiled at them. "After all, as an assistant medic, there are only a few places that I'm allowed to go, though I do get to see everyone's medical record." Doso sighed. They didn't really have a choice. If they didn't, they'd be killed. Orochimaru didn't take kindly to failures. They had already failed in the exam. Even if they hadn't really mattered in the plan, they had been there to make it seem that Oto wasn't really involved until the very end. Now, people were wondering if they had purposefully dropped out. "Hi, Kabuto-san," Doso said. Kin and Zuko folded their arms but didn't say anything. "Have fun talking to the ones who lost," Kabuto said. His face was both pleasant and bored, "and good luck." With poof of smoke, Kabuto vanished. Doso looked at the other two, who were looking nervous. Kin was playing with her hair and Zuko was shifting from foot to foot. They had every reason to be upset. This was their last chance. Granted, the last scheme hadn't been the most inspired in the world, but if they failed again, they were going to die. "Well, what are you two looking at?" Doso said, his voice betraying his tiredness. "We have losers to convert." The old woman looked like she was likely to die at any given moment and was only being held together by determination. Her face, though wrinkled and worn, gave the appearance that she had once been very pretty, and though she was slower than she had been, her muscles had not atrophied as much as most people her age. Her clothing was typical of a citizen from Wind Country, but she was traveling alone while most people seemed to like to move around in a pack for some reason. She walked slowly past the gate, ignoring the guard. The young man wasn't quite sure how to handle this situation. Yes, he had been taught that everyone was a possible threat, but this woman might just die if he was too sharp with her, causing a scandal. "Anno," he said, coming up behind her, "I need your passport." The woman stopped and stared at him as if she had never seen anything like him in her long life. Then she blinked and started to laugh, a cackling, unpleasant sound that nonetheless had probably once been attractive. "I was just pretending to be senile," she crowed, and dug in her robes for a passport and handed it to him. While he gazed at it suspiciously, she gazed at him suspiciously. "You remind me of someone," she mumbled to herself, "Uchiwa, Uchiha, Uchiha, Ryuki, yes, Uchiha Ryuki." The young man looked up. "You knew my grandfather?" He was a pretty big hero after. He looked at her and blinked, then coughed. "Move along, Chobie-san." "Don't treat me like some old lady," Cho grumbled, walking past him into the city, grumbling the entire way. She wasn't supposed to be there. The Kaze cage had given her and her brother specific orders not to turn up, but Cho seldom listened to orders anymore. She was retired, and there wasn't a whole lot that the Kaze cage could do other than throw a fit. The citizens respected her more than they respected him anyways, and she was still deadly, even if she was a little sour now. This was the first time that Cho had ever actually seen Konoha. It was a pleasant-looking place. One wouldn't have thought it was the seat for one of the most power-hungry men in the world with all the vendors and civilians running around. Cho remembered Danzu. She hadn't ever fought that man, but she had heard the rumors. Everyone had, but this place was almost peaceful. If it wasn't for the fireworks showing the beginning of the exam and the guard, Cho might have thought that she had accidentally gone to a civilian city. That wasn't going to last. Cho hadn't come here out of her grudge, she was simply here to see what was going to happen. It was idle curiosity. And of course because the Kaze cage wasn't himself making that alliance with a former Konoha to destroy Konoha. There was really something wrong with the man. It was strange that she was standing in the heart of the nation that had killed her children and destroyed her grandson and wasn't attacking. She didn't really feel anything aside from the fact that it was a warm day and her nose itched a little. She supposed that age did bring wisdom. Besides, these children here were not the ones responsible for the crimes of Konoha, and if she attacked, she would just perpetuate the cycle. Cho didn't want to create a generation of children like Sasori. Mikage Satoshi wasn't a very good ninja. He was always passed over for promotions and his love life was somewhere close to being comparable with a sedated parakeet. While he worked hard, Suna had a tendency to sneer at him. He had been a Chunin longer than any other of the ninja and nearly everyone either ignored him or was nice to him. No one was more surprised than he was when he was told that he was going to be the one to give the signal for the invasion to begin. Satoshi was beyond himself with joy. This was his chance to prove to all of them what his worth was. This was the chance for him to shine. He watched the battle before him with only passing interest. The Kusa boy and the Uchiha girl were currently involved in a mixed battle of psychological mumbo-jumbo, kunao, and whips. It really wasn't that interesting since neither of them were actually using jutsu. What was with these two? Anyways, he shook his head and looked for the signal. The guy who was supposed to make the move wasn't there. Wasn't he late? Satoshi was starting to get worried. The signal was a simple movement, just a fall from the 13th step on the 13th staircase. Maybe he had been told wrong. Maybe he had made a mistake. Maybe they had decided to use someone else. Now he was worried. All this second guessing was making him sure that he would give the signal no matter who fell. After all, what were the chances anyways? As he watched, a girl or boy, it was hard to tell at this distance, tripped and fell. That was it. That was the signal. Relief flooded over Satoshi as he put his hands together to form the jutsu that would begin everything. He didn't bother to notice the pink-haired girl who had come to help up the boy or that there was no one with pink hair in either Suna or Oto. As he watched the feathers slowly wafting down to the unsuspected audience, he smiled. Everything was going according to plan. Or so he thought. Sakura pulled Haku up and smiled at him. "I've never seen you so light on your feet," she joked. "I guess it has to happen to everyone at least once," and there was a boy's toy truck there. Haku sighed, looking embarrassed. "Well, we need to get to the top," Sakura said cheerfully, "that's where the best view is." It was also where the signal was supposed to come from. Sakura was starting to feel excited for the first time since she was there. She was getting a kind of weird thrill out of the fact that everything was going to work. It was exciting and a little scary. Secretly, she was already trying to think of just what she was going to explain to her parents about her absence. It was something that she was kind of frightened of, but looking forwards to. At the same time, it would mean that she would be separated from the group, but maybe, well, all the rest were basically orphans, maybe her parents would allow it? Probably not. Sakura remembered her mother and father. While they might have allowed Sasuke, Hinata, and Niji to live with them and tolerated Kimimaro, Haku and Sai, there was no way on this earth that they would tolerate Gaara or Naruto. Sakura could still remember the day she saw Naruto crying and her mother had dragged her daughter away from the boy that she was seriously considering running up to and giving a hug. No, Naruto and Gaara were Jinchuriki, and until they proved themselves, they were hated. "Are you alright, Emi?" Haku asked, looking concerned. "Yeah, I'm fine," Sakura smiled. "I was just thinking about after the exams." "It's best not to worry about that until we're past them," Haku said, looking at the figures of Sasuke and Yumi. "We still have a long way to go." "You worry too much." "You can never worry too much." Tsunade with the kitchen sink. Good point. It was only then that Sakura noticed the feathers and the fact that there were people falling asleep around her. Her eyes widened, and without a word, she grabbed Haku's hand and ran up to the roof, taking the steps two at a time. Sai was waiting for them, for once looking worried at their sudden appearance. "You're a little early." "Did Taki?" He trailed off looking at their faces. "Do you have the thing?" Sakura asked. "We don't have time anymore. We're setting it off now." "We were supposed to do it after the first fight," Sai reminded her, looking confused. "Someone else is starting something, we have to give the signal." Sakura almost screamed, "It doesn't matter if it isn't in the plan. Those feathers aren't in the plan either. Why are you even fighting about this, you idiot?" "Okay," Haku said before Sakura lost what little control remained over her and started to murder Sai. "Let's go." Sai took out the firework that he had stolen that morning, and Sakura lit the fuse. All three watched the firework go up, and at the blast, Sakura yelled "Kai!" undoing the genjutsu that hid their Hakumei uniforms. It had begun. Sasuke was panting a little, ignoring the wound on his shoulder from a kunai that he hadn't dodged in time. Yumi was panting a little too. Her ponytail was loose and she was starting to look annoyed that Sasuke wasn't as easily defeated as Sakura had been. "You're better than I expected," Sasuke panted. "Strange, I was going to say the same about you," Yumi said. "I really want to kill you now." Both were off again, and Yumi's whip was behind Sasuke struck him in the back. There was an explosion of smoke and Yumi was staring at a log with a tag on it. Yumi whirled around, but Sasuke was charging for her, kunai in hand. Yumi blocked with two kunai, but Sasuke sent a kick that connected. "Kinzokukawa no jutsu." Yumi gasped. What looked like a sheet of metal wrapped around her and large spikes shot out. Sasuke barely managed to jump away to keep from being impaled, but he was still wounded by one of the spikes. He clutched his side and felt wet blood. Cursing, Sasuke took out 4 more kunai and waited for Yumi to reveal herself again. When the metal went down, Yumi smirked over at Sasuke. Her hair had fallen down, and Sasuke noticed that she looked a good deal older with it like that. The high ponytail had made her look younger for some reason. Sasuke shook his head in confusion. He was thinking ridiculous things. "You're good," Yumi admitted. "Better than I thought. I wasn't going to use one of those attacks on you, but now I see that I have to. Rejoice, Kusanin. You're about to see the greatest weapon of the Uchiha clan." Sasuke didn't look impressed. How was she going to pull this off? Yumi blinked and Sasuke almost gasped. Her eyes were crimson, in them were 3 swirling marks. "The Sharingan," Sasuke muttered. Had she had a transplant? But then wouldn't it be like Kakashi's? How was this possible? "Yes," Yumi smiled. "Did you think because I was a woman that I hadn't activated it?" Uchiha Yumi, too old, not right, Sharingan. Sasuke's eyes widened. He knew. It was then that Sasuke noticed the feathers. There were hundreds of them floating down around him, and from the signs in the stands, Sasuke hadn't taken his eyes off of Yumi. There was some kind of genjutsu involved. This hadn't been the original plan. Then the explosion went off. Sasuke wasted no time worrying about the feathers or the fact that the signal was early. He threw down the flash bomb that had been in his pouch and undid the genjutsu. It was funny how much better it felt to know that everyone in the world could see his uniform. He wasn't Masaru, the cynical orphan from Kusa anymore. He was Arashi no Sasuke, the second in command of Hakumei, and anyone who doubted that would burn. The Sharingan activated behind the mask, Sasuke prepared for a true assault. Katon, Hoenka! Sasuke yelled, jumping up in the air and sending at least 3 huge fireballs hurling towards Yumi. She dodged and Sasuke landed, his hands in another pattern. I think that it's time that we stopped pretending, shouldn't we, Uchiha Yumi Ujo-san? The firework caused everyone who wasn't asleep yet to look up, and Naruto, Hinata, Gaara, Kimimaro, and Neji, all with their genjutsu undone, jumped out of the box along with everyone else. Naruto noticed that Kyoko was suddenly taking a flute from under her shirt, gross, and was dashing off with a group of people who seemed to be waiting for her. Temari and Kankuro were both already gone with Gaara in hot pursuit. Haka, after then, Naruto yelled. Kimimaro nodded and jumped off in the direction of Kyoko. Hinata and Neji knew where they had to be, and Gaara seemed intent on his mission. Shino wasn't anywhere to be seen. Crud. Naruto landed on the roof and looked around. He had his own job to do after all. Yo, loser. Naruto sighed and turned to face Sora, and his eyes widened. Sora was outlined in red, and the Kyuubi's chakra inside of him started to feel sick. It looked like he was going to have to be a little late. The explosion hadn't even finished when Jiraiya and Tsunade started moving. Both of them dashed past the VIPs with ease, ignoring the AMBU and heading straight for Danzu, who hadn't even moved yet. Both of them had kunaus ready. Unfortunately, so did the Kaze cage. No one could have been able to tell just who stabbed the figure first. One moment, the Hokage was standing with the Kaze cage besides him, and the next he was on the floor with 3 people standing over him. Jiraiya stared at the Kaze cage, who looked evenly back, with slightly peeling skin, and snake-like yellow eyes. Orochimaru, Tsunade hissed, her eyes narrow. Orochimaru said nothing, but he pulled off the remains of the mask and smiled at the two, licking his lips. There was a popping sound, and all 3 of them looked down with horror at the body of Uchiha Fugaku. They had completely forgotten about each other. What Orochimaru started, but was cut off by a war cry from the large group of ninja masquerading as civilians attacked. The battle that would go down in ninja history as the Chiryunin War had begun. Chapter 26, Part 2, Invasion. It took 5 minutes for the entire invasion to fall apart at all sides. It took much longer for the whole thing to clear up. For a moment all that Jiraiya could think was that Danzu had known. He had figured it out already, but, no, if he had, he would have killed them all outright. Danzu wasn't the type to play with his enemies. Any threat, no matter how small, was taken out cleanly and efficiently. That was how Danzu had always carried out his missions, and it would be foolish for him to stop now. This must have been planned at some time in the past. Danzu probably never intended to go to the exams at all. This was just another security measure, and they had triggered it accidentally. They should have known better. Any further thoughts on the issue were forgotten as he watched the encircling ninja. Now, Root was emotionless, and they were fanatically loyal to Danzu, but they weren't stupid. They weren't going to go one-on-one with any one of the Sunin. That would be suicide. Jiraiya also knew that they knew this. He braced himself and noticed Tsunade and Orochimaru doing the same. Do not attack. 1. Apparently the leader commanded, contact the Hokage. So, Danzu didn't know. This was going to be a surprise to him too. At least one thing was going according to plan, but they couldn't allow him to know just yet. They might have a chance to win after all. In one motion, the Sunin jumped, landing on different places in the area so that anyone who tried to escape would have to pass far too closely for them to live. Jiraiya bit his thumb and placed his hand on the ground, seeing the others doing the same. It seemed that they still reacted like a team, even now. The 3 consecutive blasts and the 3 gigantic animals that appeared only made that feeling more real. Jiraiya. Gamabunta howled, "Who do ya think you are dragging me here in the middle of my sake?" It looked like the Toad boss had been a little busy. Orochimaru. Manda hissed in a dangerous tone, "Just what is the meaning of this?" Tsunade was already deep in conversation with her summon, Katsuyu, who didn't seem to resent being summoned as much as the others. Tsunade always had all the luck with summons. What was worse was now Gamabunta and his children seemed to have decided that they liked Naruto better than him. "There are your sacrifices, Manda," Orochimaru said, "Eat." "Don't command me," the snake hissed. Nevertheless, he did attack, along with Jiraiya and Tsunade, tearing through the 20 ninja with a fury that made even Jiraiya feel a little sickened. He only turned away in time to notice that someone with a bird mask had managed to climb up Gamabunta and about to charge him. Jiraiya dodged the attack and sent a kick that caused the root to slip and fall. Jiraiya winced a little bit, but was back to business immediately. It took the 3 of them almost no time to dispose of the root. Jiraiya and Tsunade turned around abruptly to face Orochimaru. No words passed between them. Really, no words could pass. There was nothing to say. For a moment, Jiraiya was faced with their genin picture. They looked so innocent, so carefree. Even Orochimaru's face had held some amusement at their antics. What happened? Why had things changed? It didn't matter anymore. Jiraiya looked at the man who had once been his best friend and made his decision. He was prepared for the worst, prepared to kill that boy. A bird chirped from somewhere, and the Sunin jumped to attack. Naruto refused to have a fight with Sora right in the middle of the arena with the Sunin clashing overhead and Sasuke and Yumi both trying to murder each other below him. That would have been stupid. He jumped down into the forested area and yelled up for Sora to hear. "Come on, you fake Jinchuriki." That definitely caught his attention. Sora tore off into the trees in hot pursuit, yelling something that Naruto couldn't hear, and the red around him started to intensify. Naruto was starting to feel something in his stomach churning. It looked like Fuzzy Wuzzy was noticing that a part of itself was nearby. Red was already at the edge of his vision, but Naruto refused to give in. He had a job to do, and Kyuubi and his freedom wasn't going to get in the way. They still had a chance. "Futon, Jihasho!" Sora yelled, one arm going in front of him in a violent slashing motion. The attack hit Naruto right in the middle of the back and the clone exploded, knocking Sora backwards into a tree. "Wait!" Sora gasped out as regained his footing. "That was a bunchin Debakaha," Naruto grinned, jumping down behind him. "Lose the mask." Sora growled, "You're just some half-baked ninja who thinks that looking like Akatsuki makes him powerful." "So you know about Akatsuki," Naruto said, "that's interesting. So you're really Danzu's little stooge after all, but you're wrong. We're not pretending to be Akatsuki or even all that interested in them. I'm called Shibuya, the leader of Hakumei, the group who will spell out the end of Danzu's Konoha." "That's not your name," Sora hissed. "Nope," Naruto nodded, "you're keeping up nicely." "You're a coward," Sora snarled, the red cloak around him growing thicker and more obvious. "Futon, Jiharepyosho." Naruto dodged the attack without too much trouble, but his vision was going red. He could see the red chakra that was a sign of the Kyuubi was starting to envelope him into what was almost a cloak. Part of him was screaming for Sora's blood, and the other part was struggling just to keep himself under control. Slowly, Naruto realized that he was standing on his hands and knees. For some reason, this seemed appropriate. "Kill him." Sora was starting to look a little nervous that his opponent was doing the same thing as he was, but he too was on all fours. "I don't care what kinds of tricks you use, Sora spat, I'm going to take you down no matter what, and show Danzu-sama just what I'm made of." "Kage Bunshin no Jutsu," was the only reply. Yumi's eyes were slightly wider than usual as she faced Sasuke, now in his uniform with his face covered. Behind his mask, Sasuke was grinning fiercely, the Sharingan almost glowing. Finally, he had gotten under her skin. After all this time, he had gotten to see Yumi's emotionless face was an expression of shock. Now for an expression of horror. "Well, this is a surprise," Yumi said softly. She looked around, but Genma was nowhere in sight. "I see, so you planned this the whole time." Too bad you'll fail. So, where is he? You're rather overconfident, Yumi Ujo-san, Suzuki smirked. Genma-san has work to do, it's just the two of us. So we can fight without all the annoying rules. Yumi laughed a little at that title, a hard, cold laugh that didn't suit a 12-year-old girl. You think that just by figuring that out, you'll win? You'll be very disappointed. Uchiha Yumi, age 19, user of Earth and Fire, graduated the academy at age 12, Chiyunin at the same age, currently a jonin, formerly in an arranged engagement with Uchiha Itachi. You'd be amazed by how much I know about you, Suzuki told her. After all, he had looked at her with all the dislike of a younger sibling who felt that she was unworthy of his wondrous Nii-sama. Suzuki remembered her now. Yumi was naturally small, and with the help of a little makeup and change in hairstyle, she could pass as a child. She didn't even need a genjutsu, which was troublesome and would wear off if you stopped thinking about it. She was the perfect plant. Suzuki wouldn't have thought of her though. The two of them had had almost no actual relationship, and it had been a very long time. Uchiha Yumi came from one of the best families within the Uchiha clan, second only to the leader's family, and she had been recognized for her ability and the fact that she had activated the Sharingan at the tender age of 10, unlike most women in the Uchiha clan who never activated it. She had been engaged to the younger Uchiha Itachi, as a political marriage. Both families had power and the joining would have been advantageous to both. There had been high hopes that they would produce very powerful heirs. That had obviously never happened. Suzuki only narrowly dodged the whip that had threatened to impale him. Don't you dare speak that traitor's name to me. Yumi snarled. He threw his pride in the dirt and ran off like some civilian whose precious little brother had been kidnapped. He was no ninja. Suzuki felt rage building up inside him. Who did she think this was? Itachi had only tolerated her because he had to. Besides, if Suzuki remembered right, Yumi hadn't particularly cared for Itachi, so what was she complaining about? He ignored Yumi's precious little brother comment, and sent a fireball at her. Yumi dodged it easily. The problem with that technique was that as long as you didn't freeze, you'd be able to avoid it. It's interesting, you know, I was set up to watch Hatake Kakashi, and I ended up fighting a missing nin, Yumi said, dashing forward and aiming a kick at Suzuki. If he dodged, Suzuki was going to hit the whip, but if he ducked, he could get her in the gut. Suzuki was about to duck, but then it seemed that the whip was going to change direction, so ducked and sidestepped, knocking away the whip with a kunao. It was slightly disturbing to fight someone with the Sharingan when you had the Sharingan. Zabuza cursed for the 1000th time since the signal went off. It had gone off way too soon, but not before there was a giant snake tearing down the walls, and the Sunanin, Baki, who he had been loitering with, had suddenly tried to take him prisoner, saying that it was nothing personal, but he couldn't have. Zabuza aiding Konoha, Hibiki, the snake-like Jonin, vanishing in a puff of smoke that revealed him to be a Kage Bunshin, and the fat Kusa Jonin ending up being a fat Otonin who was maybe 15 who also attacked him. Zabuza had only barely managed to counter both attacks with his darling sword and make a dash for the main building, only to have to dodge the giant snake that he burst through the walls, and the fact that everyone was fighting everyone. The genjutsu was gone, and he was now running around looking like himself, and already Zabuza had been attacked by Root, Oto, and Sunanin. Once he was even attacked by Matogai, a Kainan supporter, by mistake. That had been slightly disturbing since the man had apologized by flashing a smile so toothy it would have made Kisame jealous, giving a thumbs up, apologizing for his mistake, and as a sort of blessing said that he hoped that the flames of youth would continue to burn within him. Zabuza had forgotten just how creepy a place Konoha was. Those kids were relatively normal, even if some of them did come from this madhouse. Maybe he would give them some parting advice about green spandex before he left them to go on his merry way with Isaribi. Just because they did have some sanity. Oddly enough, he missed that girl. Well, after 3 or so years, he couldn't help but like the little twit. And now that Hakukid and her seemed to be writing to one another, and he knew just where that was going to lead. He'd kill the idiot boy. But that wasn't important. He had a mission to complete. It had been some time since Zabuza had been given anything that even resembled a mission. He had jobs. Jobs that people were willing to pay quite a bit to be completed. Missing Nin didn't usually go on missions anymore, and he was kind of enjoying this one. Besides, it was an excuse to attack the Hokage building, and Zabuza was remembering the thrill he had gotten out of the whole Mizukage assassination. Now that had been fun. Miyako, Reiga, and he had stormed the building with just the three of them and were happily taking out everything that had stood in their way. That was when the seven had been disbanded. Kisame had betrayed them all, and informed the Mizukage just what was being planned. The whole operation had fallen apart due to that betrayal. The Mizukage had managed to turn the other three to his side without too much trouble. Zabuza and Reiga had only barely managed to make it out with their lives. The two of them had split up, and the last that Zabuza heard of him, he had basically lost what little sanity that he had left. And Miyako. Zabuza's hand gripped his sword tighter and kicked the doors open. The Mizukage had been deposed later by a full-scale rebellion, but he and Reiga hadn't been called back. They were considered too dangerous, even if they were only doing what everyone else had really wished had been done. The others, the ones who had lived that long anyways, were put to death for their loyalty to the former Mizukage, but Kisame had gotten away. Kisame had joined the group known as Akatsuki. The name of the seven swordsmen was now one that was synonymous to senseless murder. It was sort of resurrected later, but it was never the same. It had fallen apart before the whole attempt to kill the Mizukage thing anyways. Now, he was doing the same thing as he had done all those years ago, and it felt good. There weren't too many people there. Everyone important, including Danzu himself, were somewhere else. Probably, word had reached Danzu that something was wrong, and he was mustering up a real counterattack, not this flimsy security that Kainan had hoped to get past through the element of surprise. Well, it didn't really concern him if the kids weren't ready. They had to learn to deal with what happened when plans blew up. They weren't his problem. He was just here for the final part of his job. Most people who were left in the building jumped back as Zabuza swung the sword and dashed up the stairs. He was grinning behind his mask. The old rush of adrenaline was pulsing through his veins. It was just like that time. Dashing through the building, cutting down anyone who was in his way, knowing that no one could stand up to you. Zabuza was not an honorable man. He couldn't care less about finding a worthy opponent. Zabuza just liked the thrill from winning. This was bringing that thrill back to him. A root member with a mask that looked like some kind of smiling mammal that Zabuza would have eaten if it was real, met him at the entrance to the interrogation room. Zabuza was grinning like some kind of maniac behind his mask. "Oh, great," Zabuza said, preparing his sword. "I was getting tired of just swinging things around, and she was starting to want to taste some blood. Stand there and be my target." "You will go no further," the Rootin said, ignoring Zabuza. Zabuza snorted. Did people actually talk like that in this village? Well, only the really creepy ones. The members of Kainan were weird, but they didn't sound like something in a cheesy novel that perverted teacher hermit thing had written. Who read that stuff other than Sherry non Kakashi anyways? Zabuza charged forwards, swinging his sword, and the Rootin jumped, narrowly avoiding the blow, making a series of hand gestures. "Kage Bunshin no Jutsu," he said. A double appeared immediately and both attacked Zabuza from different angles. It might have been harder if Zabuza hadn't been sparring with Naruto, the Kage Bunshin king, before this fight, and he had gotten some strategies for dealing with Kage Bunshin. The first was, unless your name happened to be Shibuya no Naruto, the things were so draining that you could only make 5 tops, and that was on a good day. Basically, since Kage Bunshin could execute their own attacks, they also had to have a supply of chakra. That seriously cut down yours. Naruto, being a Jinhiriki, had so much chakra, that it simply didn't matter. He could create his own army, and would only feel a little tired. If Naruto had full access to the Baijuyu's chakra, it would be even scarier. This guy was nothing. A good hit and the clone would be gone. A good swipe and he might hit the nin as well. Zabuza swung his sword and charged, still not bothering to actually use a jutsu. A scream reached his ears, but Zabuza didn't turn around to see what was left of the man. If he was alive, good for him; if not, too bad. Zabuza, demon of the bloody mist, had returned to take on a hidden village, and no little peon was going to bother him. Even if his wasn't the main part, Zabuza wanted to revel in his memories. He kicked open the door to the Inquisition room and into the prison. He stopped at one of the cells and hoisted his sword over one shoulder. "Heya, princess," he smirked, "I'm here to rescue you." Yujito looked at Zabuza with mixed shock and disgust. "Who the heck are you?" she asked, one eyebrow raised. "Takei sent me," Zabuza sneered back. This little chick was a little too sure of herself for him. He actually liked shy girls, particularly when they were younger than him. Zabuza blinked as the thought occurred to him. Somehow, that didn't sound right. Yujito raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me." "Yep, Takei, or at least the person you know as Takei, sent me. He left a message too. Something about a promise." Yujito blinked. This was not something she had been prepared for. "You mean he actually?" Yujito didn't seem to want to believe him. "You should really be careful with who you promise things to." Zabuza was really starting to enjoy this. "You never know just how they are." Zabuza was about to force open the door when the door of the Inquisition room opened again, and someone that he knew very well stepped into the hall. "Well, when I saw you I didn't think that you'd be doing something like this, Zabuza," the man grinned, showing teeth that were too sharp for a human. His skin was blue and strangely smooth, and there were gills attached to his neck. His eyes were wrong too, they were small, and white, but the very center of them was a dead black that looked somehow unreal. "Kisame," Zabuza breathed out, looking for the first time in years at the man who had single-handedly torn the 7 swordsmen apart. A ladle made a pretty pathetic weapon. Anko decided this as she and Kurenai stood in front of the aged owner of Ichiraku Ramen, who had apparently tried to defend his daughter's honor and beat off both Oto and Suna with only a ladle as a weapon. It was amazing that the man had lived this long. Beiki, the Jonin instructor of some of the participants in the exam, was facing them with an annoyed look on his face. The annoyance was probably due to the fact that some of his men had actually been beaten into submission by the old ramen vendor. "Yeah, no," Anko said in a conversational tone to Kurenai, "I used to really have respect for Suna, but I think I've lost most of it." "Most of it?" Kurenai asked, her crimson eyes showing their amusement at the whole situation despite how the fact that they were all but surrounded. "Okay, all of it," Anko smirked. "I was going to use a summon, but I don't really think they're worth it anymore." "You know, we're right here," Beiki said, looking annoyed. "Of course we do, we're just ignoring you," Kurenai said, smiling a little. "Well, Anko, do you want to have some fun?" Anko cracked her knuckles and grinned a little. "Let's play," she said, bringing her hands into 2 seals, "Sene Jashu." Kurenai nodded and put her own hands together, "Magen, Jubakusatsu." One of the Chiryunin suddenly went very still and seemed to be staring out into space as Kurenai approached him. Snakes appeared in Anko's sleeves and shot towards Beiki and his men. Beiki dodged but one of the others didn't. A creepy grin appeared on Anko's face as the creatures wrapped themselves around their prisoner. She yanked the snakes and the Chiryunin was yanked forwards a few steps. "My cute babies," she said to the snakes the same way that most people would talk to a real baby, "bear with mummy for a little bit. I promise I'll feed you something good." Anko jumped, pivoting off of the wall of the ramen shop to give her altitude and then yanking the snakes into the air. After a moment of pulling him up, the snakes suddenly unwound themselves and pushed the Chiryunin higher than Anko. Anko jumped up to meet him and kicked him in the stomach, sending him slamming to the ground. Anko landed lightly and made a victory sign. "Ha! The beautiful single Anko-chan defeats her enemies again," she crowed. It was then that Anko heard an explosion behind her and saw 3 Chiryunin who had been sneaking up on her fall to the ground. Anko turned around and blinked at the bodies and Kurenai, who had made quick work of her victim, but had been a little busy to notice Anko's problem. "You need to pay more attention. If my students were here, I'd be using you as an example of what not to do," an amused male voice said. Anko looked up and grinned at the form of Irika, bit her finger and slammed her hand to the ground. A moment later, she was standing eye level to him, on the head of a very large snake. "You saved my life," Anko said with a small smile. "I'll give you something really good when all of this is over." The last part was said in more of a sing-song voice with a weird grin on her face. Irika blinked and blushed at her words. Maybe it would have been better just to have yelled for her to watch out. "Hurry up, you double-headed monstrosity." Teiwaya yelled behind her at the forms of Seikon and Yukon as they ran on the rooftops towards the Uchiha district. You shouldn't say such things, Teiwaya, Jirobo reprimanded her. Oh, shut up, lard butt, she snared, grumbling a few choice words under her breath. Teiwaya was anything but in a good mood. Everything had seemed to have been going well. As Kyoko, she had infiltrated things wonderfully. Since they had already captured the real Kusa-genin and Orochimaru-sama was going to use them for his own jutsu, she, Seikon, Yukon, pretending to be Ren, and Kidomaru, as Aoi, acted as students while Jirobo pretended to be their teacher. It was perfect, and no one, not even the other Kusa-genin, had suspected them. And apparently someone else had thought of the same plan. Because there were 3 groups, all fighting for different reasons, no one's plans were quite working right. It was amazing that things hadn't turned into a total bloodbath, but there were areas where only a fool would go. Like the arena, if you didn't get squashed by a summon, impaled by a stray kunao or murdered by an elemental jutsu, you'd get killed by the Uchiha chick and her little problem. Well, one less member of that weird little team, the better. At least they hadn't been followed. So, since when were we supposed to abduct some weak Uchiha kid from the district? I thought that was supposed to be Kabuto's job. He got the kid while we ran amok, killed Danzu, and went home. I don't see why we didn't just grab the Yumi chick when we had the chance, Kidomaru grumbled. Because Orochimaru-sama wants his first new body to be male, you idiot, Yukon sneered. Either that or he just doesn't like girls much, Teiwaya shrugged. Women always think that when someone doesn't find them attractive, they must be gay, Seikon smirked while his twin brother snickered. Teiwaya glared at both of them. Well, excuse her for noticing that Orochimaru seemed to avoid girls like the plague. Even that one crystal user who was all but undressing herself for him was ignored. She would have loved to tell them just what she thought, but they were a little busy. Well, it wasn't like the 4, 5 of them were actually fond of each other. Teiwaya hated each and every one of them. But she supposed that was just how teams were. You put up with the other members because your boss told you to. Well, as fun as this conversation is to listen to, another voice said from nowhere, I'm going to have to break things up. Tessenka no mai, Tsuru. The white thing appeared from nowhere, narrowly missing Jirobo, who was surprisingly fast for his weight and managed to dodge. The figure of a masked man wearing a white haori with a blue flame pattern on it. The single kanji and the mask read simply Haka. He was holding what Teiwaya realized was a chain staff, which seemed to have been shaped like someone's spine. Wait. That was completely disgusting. You're that chauvinist. She almost screamed, Yuma or whatever. My name is Haka no Kimimaro, and I will also be your executioner. His voice was completely different than what it had been. It wasn't laid back, or amused. The closest it had been to this was when he had threatened to kill the dog of that one Konoha dog kid. It was dead, cold, and completely uncaring. He's a little full of himself, don't you think? Seikon said to his brother. Let's teach the trash a little lesson, Yukon grinned. Jirobo readied himself and Kidomaru was already crawling up the wall. Teiwaya pressed her flute to her lips. There was no way that this clown was going to win against all 4 of them at the same time. He must really be an idiot. It was then that Teiwaya played a note, and realized that Kimimaro was already gone and had appeared right behind Seikon and Yukon, his spinal cord staff spinning as the dance began. Ibiki was one of the few members of Kainan who was not giving away his position to anyone. He was too useful in his place and not particularly useful anywhere else. Ibiki knew all of Konoha's secrets and plans, or, at least, he thought that he had. Apparently, Danzu had kept a few to himself. The old man was watching the battles from the safety of the Hokage monument, where the evacuation for the civilians had used to be, leaning on his staff, and seemingly undisturbed by the total destruction being unleashed. If it had been in a contained area, Ibiki wouldn't have cared. He had seen carnage and had been tortured enough to have pretty thick skin, but this went beyond a lot that he had seen. 3 sections of the wall had been broken down, there were snake summons everywhere, no one had had enough time to get the civilians to a safe place, and no one knew whose side who was on. Danzo couldn't send any ninja into the arena, unless he wanted to kill them. The legendary Sunin would turn around and unanimously attack pretty much anyone who got between them and then return to fighting. Uchiha Yumi was fighting against one of Hakumei, probably Sasuke, and she wasn't responding to summons. The three prominent clans had proven themselves to be traitors along with several powerful ninja. It was amazing how calm Danzo could be while everything fell apart. "Ibiki, come here," Danzo said in a calm voice. Ibiki walked over, kneeling down. "Hi, Hokage-sama. Be prepared to commence interrogations on all who are captured. This battle may not be won, but it will not be lost either. We are at an advantage." They were expecting me to be at the exams, and because of that, both groups have lost the element of surprise that they were hoping for. The loss of Uchiha Fugaku is a tragedy, but we must use the mistake to our advantage. While our opponents possibly outnumber us, they are now disorganized, and unsure of who to fight. Unfortunately, the same holds true for us. My root does not know who is loyal and who is a traitor. We are treading on delicate ground, Ibiki, and I want you to do whatever it takes to find out the identity of every single traitor. Danzo did not look at him. "Hi, Hokage-sama," Ibiki said, keeping his head down. "If I may be so bold, what of the Sunin? I believe that they are traitors as well. They held on to the foolish ideals of their teacher, and refused to grasp the reality of what I had planned for them. Also, they seem to have been working alongside the unknown team of missing Nin in order to depose me. Their fighting against Orochimaru is convenient for us, but they are not on our side." "I see." That meant that Danzo had probably intended to kill them after this exam from the start. Once they got rid of Orochimaru, they really weren't useful to Danzo anymore. He probably would have assigned them a final student, a root graduate most likely, and then have them sent off on some suicidal mission after it was over. "One more there, Ibiki," Danzo said soft. "While my faith in you is unshaken, I fear that you have poor taste in your assistants, if Mitarashi Anko is any indication. I will be assigning your help personally from now on. After all, our power will be weakened after this incident, and I do not wish for any mistakes to be made." Crud. The streets were a madhouse. Everyone was fighting absolutely everyone, and no one in Konoha was quite sure who was on whose side. Hinata and Niji moved as quickly as they could, avoiding major fights and trying to make it to the point they were supposed to reach. Hinata wasn't sure if this was even going to work anymore. With the fact that there were three factions running around, it was amazing that it was working at all. They, along with Sakura, Sai, and Haku, were charged with aiding Kainan in this sector of the village, but it wasn't easy to tell just who was on their side. Root had quickly gotten rid of their masks once they realized that both groups would attack them before attacking one another, and Hinata hadn't seen all of Kainan, nor could she have remembered if she had. Kainan had been fairly large, and Hinata wasn't always the best at remembering faces. At last, Hinata's eyes fixed on the shape of the sickly-looking Hayate, who was fighting two opponents at the same time with only a single sword. She didn't see anyone familiar with him and it looked like he was in a very bad situation. "Raisin!" Hinata called out. Hinata didn't bother to see just who her opponent was. She prepared for one of the more or less traditional attacks of her clan. Being unknown was no longer a big deal, and poison attacks could easily go out of control in places like this one. "Juho Sashiken!" Hinata cried, as chakra formed around her hands and she forced it at a man who was wearing a black outfit that labeled him as Root. "Hakukusho!" She heard Niji's voice call from close beside her. Her cousin's attack was much more powerful than hers, but he also didn't have the accuracy she did quite yet, and it hit his opponent and those around him with less power than it should have. Hayate stood back to back with Hinata and nodded to her. "Thank you for the help," he said. "I was separated from my group, and I seem to have stepped into another problem." "I can see that," Niji said, crouching into the pose for Hakusho Kaiten, knees bent, and both arms out, hands with their palms up. "You can thank us when we get out of this," Hinata said, looking at the circle that was growing around them and entering into the Juken pose. Everyone attacked at the same time, and Hinata lost track of everything else as she fought. There were 3 people that she was fighting, but none of them were Root. Hinata struck out, dodged a taijutsu strike and hit one man in the chest, and whirled around to face another. It seemed like the pattern went on forever. It was when Hinata was fainting away from a large man who must have been a samurai in his spare time when she saw it. The Hyuga clan was also there. She knew the robes and the eyes like hers, but what was upsetting was that they were fighting each other, and she couldn't see her father anywhere with them. Hinata snapped back to reality in time to dodge a sword that was aimed for her side and kick up. This was a move that her father would have slapped her for using. A Hyuga should not resort to kicking a man in the groin. It was completely dishonorable. Hinata disagreed now. After all, a target was a target. Besides, as Jiraiya had told her, ninja cheat, it's what they do. Niji snickered a little as the man fell to the ground, and they took advantage the ruckus to fall back into a small alley and into another street. Still fighting dirty, I see, Hinata could hear the smile. There's no such thing as fighting dirty, unless of course you fall in the mud while fighting. Hinata smiled back, then she turned to Hayate. Where are the others supposed to meet during this kind of an emergency? We should have been able to meet close to here. At Ichiraku Ramen, but there are some problems there. Anko's not helping. Hayate sighed. Jinta and Akira were supposed to be here, but obviously they've been forced to withdraw. Well, let's see if we can get somewhere with more members. We can't hang around this area too much more, Niji said, looking around. No one's paying too much attention, but sooner or later someone's going to see us, and then we'll have fight pretty much everyone here. They started walking, but Hinata noticed the thing come out from behind the garbage can. It rushed directly at her, dodged the first kick that she sent and grabbed onto the leg in a kind of violent embrace. Hinata-ne-san! Cried Hyuga Hanabi, I knew that you'd come. Haku and Sakura stood back to back, in the center of a bridge preparing to attack again. Kainan was attacking close by, but Haku and Sakura had drawn the attention of the Uchiha guards, who seemed to have decided that it was directly their fault that Uchiha Fugaka was dead. Well, they had a point. Are you ready, Haku? Sakura asked sweetly, turning towards him. I think they're ready. Haku smiled and the air suddenly became very cold and a mist formed around them as he took out an umbrella. Where'd you get that? Sakura asked. Team Shigo got it from an opponent. Nice. I like it. As the bridge iced over, both of them heard the sounds of fighting from Sakura's side of the bridge. She ignored it. The plan was that the mist would cover everything while Haku froze everything over. Then Sakura would hide the ice in a lovely genjutsu and everyone would rush to attack them, then end up having problems and allowing Haku and her to win much more easily. Sakura braced herself as the mist began to thin, and heard the jingle of bells just in time to dodge the senbon that had been aimed at her face. Sakura recognized the attack and threw a kunao at the bell, shattering it before the attack could be completed. Kin, that's enough. Sakura heard someone's voice say. I just wanted to test her and see if she was any good. Her hair seriously annoys me, the girl's voice sounded slightly sulky. Can't we just kill them? Another voice, irritable and irritating, asked. You heard him, you idiot, that would be Doso, the leader of the 3 Oto Genin who had been in the preliminaries. The mist finally cleared away completely and left them now with Uchiha on one side of them and the 3 Oto Genin on the other. It looked like the Uchiha on Sakura's side seemed to be gone. Genjutsu? Or had they been confused by the bells? Sakura really didn't have time to worry about it. All she had time to do was get ready for this battle. She was actually really looking forwards to this. It was about time that she could actually fight. Sakura gathered the chakra into her fists the way that Tsunade had taught her to and grinned a little bit. I'm really looking forwards to this, she said, cracking her knuckles. She had really wanted to get back at Kin for the hair comments for a while now. It wasn't her fault that she had pink hair. She hadn't planned this out. She would have been fine with a normal color that wasn't so pink. This girl had no right to make fun of it. It was strange how she was now more upset about her hair than her forehead. She guessed things changed. Kin smirked back and Haku just shook his head and looked over at the other two and bowed slightly. Sakura-chan's busy at the moment, so I suppose I'll fight both of you, he said. I won't hold back just because you're a girl, Zuko said, grinning. One of Haku's eyes twitched. Rock Lee hadn't even been in the arena when everything began. He had been training in his usual spot, attempting to lift a boulder that he really shouldn't have been able to and generally minding his own business. While he would have liked to have had the chance to see his rival Haru fight, it depressed him that he couldn't be there. Lee pumped himself up again and shook off the feeling. Such feelings were befitting of an old man regretting that life had passed him by, not of a young one who had everything before him. Lee punched the air, and returned to his usual training. He couldn't allow himself to be depressed. Guy-sensei would have been disappointed in him. Very disappointed. That was when he heard the explosion. What? Was all he got out before he saw the Sunanin appear all around him. Konoha citizen, if you wish to live, put your hands in the air, one of the ninja, a Chiryunin said calmly. It was true, Lee was nothing more than a citizen, even with Guy's training. There was nothing that he could do. For a moment he hung his head, but he stopped. No. Guy-sensei had seen something in him. Haru hadn't laughed at him when Lee proclaimed them to be rivals. He couldn't let them down. They were waiting for him to take his place as a true ninja. I shall never surrender in the springtime of my youth. Lee cried, taking a taijutsu stance, let us all begin. The 5 Chiryunin looked at each other in an amused kind of way, and the woman in the group took out the naginata that she was carrying. All right, have it your way, she grinned. Stop it, another man said, obviously the leader. You have other things to do than play with the civilians, Akiko-chan. Don't talk to me so familiarly, Akiko grumbled, all right, I'll get to my position. Hurry up, Beiki, the Kaze cage won't wait forever you know. Beiki nodded, and seemed to prepare for battle. Lee got himself into the pose that Guy-sensei had taught him to take when facing a powerful enemy. Beiki had taken out a katana, so he had a better range than Lee did, and Lee couldn't use any jutsu to help himself. Beiki moved fast, faster than Lee had thought that he would, but Lee managed to jump out of the way, attempting to ricochet off one of the trees and land and kick on him, but Beiki seemed to have guessed where this was going. It was unfortunate, but Lee wasn't in the shape that he should have been. Guy-sensei had always lamented that the boy wasn't his student and he didn't have the time that he would have liked to train him. He didn't even know a lot of special combos. The katana whipped around quickly and barely missed grazing Lee's side. Lee backflipped a few feet and jumped, trying to make an aerial kick. Beiki caught the first attack, but Lee twisted a little, and managed to kick him in the side. Beiki let out a grunt of pain and released Lee's leg. Lee jumped back, ready to continue but panting hard. Dynamic entry. A very loud voice yelled as another green spandex-clad figure jumped right in front of Beiki. Guy-sensei! Lee cheered. Beiki said nothing, just raised his blade to a more defensive position. Lee, Guy said, his back to him, get to town, find Kakashi, or Kurane. If you see people who are wearing masks and hairs with blue flames, you can trust them. Don't trust anyone else, and remember, I want to see you as a great ninja with the flames of youth always burning brightly in you. Something about the serious tone that Guy had taken made it so Lee didn't argue. He didn't even look back as he dashed away, and he didn't hear the words that drifted after him. Good luck, my number 1 student. Chapter 27, Part 2, Heat of Battle. Gaara sometimes wished that people weren't so darn fragile. They were kind of like grapefruit unless he was really, really careful. Gaara didn't really want to kill anyone that badly, but it was hard to control yourself with all the noise going on outside of and inside of his head. With Sandy Wandy's screaming and the Nara clan's attacks, it was amazing that Gaara had any control over his sand at all. He had followed his siblings only to find that they had headed straight for the Hokage monument and straight into the guard of Rutanin who were protecting it. Apparently it wasn't used for civilians anymore. From the numbers of people around it, it was probably where the real Danzo was safely hidden with about 10 or 20 of his more trusted men, and directing the battle from there. He was clever, but he wouldn't risk his own life in this battle, not when both attacking sides seemed to agree that he and Root should be disposed of first before trying to kill each other. Besides, he was unsure of who was loyal at the moment, and he wasn't going to risk himself. Smart but not endearing to the rest of the ninja. Gaara was standing in the center of a swirling dome of sand that was obeying his silent orders and attacking those around him. The Nara seemed to have been about to mount an attack when the Sunanin arrived, and he was now standing in front of a large group of them, including one Shikamaru, apparently an old friend of Naruto. This is such a pain, Shikamaru sighed as the man who had been frozen by Shikamaru's shadow was attacked by Damari's fan. Whose side are we on anyways? Ours, Gaara said, shooting his hand around the pair of them and making it snake out to attack one of Kankuro's puppets. He really felt guilty about doing that. Shikamaru nodded a little in agreement and sidestepped one of his mother's kunai. Was that woman human? Her attacks were enough to honestly freak out Shikaku slightly. She'd just impaled that one guy. Shikamaru didn't seem like he was the greatest fighter in the world, but he was excellent at tactics. Gaara was pretty sure that he had a long, happy career ahead of him. Not that he actually wanted it, so maybe it would be the god's way of getting back at him for his laziness. It was appropriate. Gaara sent a tendril of sand out, surrounding Temari and Kankuro as a few more Sunanin appeared. He noticed as something came flying towards him but was blocked by his sand. Gaara moved his eyes to see the form of Matsuri, breathing hard and looking wildly at him. "Leave my teammates alone," she yelled, looking more terrified that she was being stupid enough to face him head-on than anything else. Gaara's sand wrapped around her before she could attack again. Matsuri's eyes widened and she struggled, but nothing happened. Finally, Matsuri took a deep breath, and Gaara raised an eyebrow. She wasn't. She was. Gaara's sand wrapped around her mouth very quickly. There was absolutely no way that he was going to have poison spat at him. He had trained enough with Hinata to know that even when it was done alone, it was a dangerous technique. "I'm surprised you figured out how to copy that jutsu after only seeing it once," Gaara admitted, "and by the surprised looks of your teammates, they didn't know you could accomplish that either." Shikamaru looked from Matsuri to Gaara to Temari and Kankuro and seemed to decide to leave Gaara to his work. This wasn't any of his business, and his father needed all the help that he could get in order to keep Root from advancing. At least he had Chuji and his family to help. If only Ino was there. While she was a pain, the whole Ino Shikacho thing was actually a good team. Matsuri glared over at Gaara, trying to say something, but Gaara shook his head. "No, Matsuri-san," Gaara said, "I won't let you talk to me. I saw that jutsu too." It was then that Temari's cage bunshin vanished and Gaara's sand formed a dome around him to protect him from the wind that blasted towards him. "I don't want to fight you, Gaara," Temari whispered, jumping down a little ways away from him, "but I have a duty to Suna. I understand if you don't. You have no reason to care about Suna one way or the other, but it's my home, God-forsaken Dust Bowl, or not, and I'm going to defend it." Gaara. Something seemed to click with Kankuro and Matsuri's eyes had widened and she started making sounds like she really wanted to talk. "Yes, Kankuro, this is Gaara. He lived through Yashimaru's little suicide," Temari sighed, "and now he's siding with Konoha." "I'm not with Konoha," Gaara said, the sand around him preparing to attack, "at least not mainstream Konoha. My friends want to get rid of the current Hokage, and I am going to help them. So that's why Konoha seems to be fighting itself," Kankuro muttered, jerking his head back to avoid a stray kunai, "I thought." "It doesn't matter," Gaara sighed. "I don't have time to talk like this. I'm going to capture all of you." Temari smiled a little bit, then, "Otauto, let's play a friendly game. You win, and we come with you nicely. I win and you tell us about the abilities of your friends." There was no way that Temari was going to win, and she must have known that. She was buying time. Knowing that Gaara wouldn't want to hurt them. That was his sister. Sakura was, ironically, having the time of her life. She was fighting 2-on-1 with two mid-range fighters and doing a pretty good job of matching the pair of them. She was grinning as she snatched a senbon with bells attached to it out of the air. She'd already physically crushed the first bells that they sent her way, and was dashing towards Zuko with a chakra-enhanced punch. Needless to say, both Zuko and Kin were rather frustrated and were taking it out on one another. "You idiot, we're fighting a girl with pink hair, you're slowing me down." Kin yelled as Sakura sent an exploding tag towards her. "Shannaro!" she yelled as the thing exploded. She was going to pound these two into something like rice flour. Sakura was the only member of Hakumei to have lost to anyone aside from another member, and it was both embarrassing that she had lost to a genin and angering that Sasuke thought that he could get revenge for her. She was going to pound Uchiha Yumi all by herself, "Thank you." She jumped to avoid the blast that came from Zuko's arms, and almost crashed her head into Kin, who had been jumping above her. Both Sakura and Kin kicked, and fell, clutching their sides. Sakura was up in a moment, ready to continue. It was only out of the corner of her eye that she actually saw the old lady. She was dressed like a Suna citizen and was watching the fight from a distance, seeming to be very interested and not at all caring about the fact that there was a battle going on around her. She would occasionally sidestep a kunao, but that was about it. She seemed to be completely unaware of the man who was creeping up on her from behind, preparing to attack. Sakura closed her eyes tight and preformed the one-hand symbol needed. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. She felt the exhaustion of having her chakra almost halved but bore with it. It didn't take much to enhance her punches and she didn't need to do one of her genjutsus yet. She should have enough. The Bunshin dashed at Kin and Zuka while Sakura bolted towards the old woman, and throwing a kunao at the man behind her to make him dodge and slow him down, she attacked. Jerk! Sakura yelled, actually getting a good look at his face and recognizing him as the guy who had come with Niji, Kimimaro and Haku in the exams. Kamamo or something like that, going after her like that. Sakura sent a chakra-enhanced punch towards him, but the gray-haired young man dodged and jumped onto the roof. Nishoku-san, you're surprisingly perceptive, the man said with a smile. I hadn't thought you would notice me with everything going on around you. Sakura snorted, but didn't relax. She could feel him getting himself ready to attack, and there was a masked killing intent in the air around her, but it didn't feel like it was directed at her. Actually, his eyes seemed to be on Kin and Zaku, who had stopped fighting the Bunshin and were looking nervous. Unfortunately, Nishoku-san, I'm going to have to kill that woman. She's far too dangerous to be allowed to live. Kabuto moved fast. Faster than Suzuki was, and the old woman crumbled. Sakura didn't have time to scream. Particularly when the body disappeared in a puff of smoke to show a log with a kunao sticking out of it. There was a cackle of laughter as the old woman jumped down from behind Sakura. Just kidding, she said, I was only pretending to be dead. She seemed to find this kind of thing amusing. The old woman looked at Sakura in a gauging way, but then back to Kabuto. I don't know what group you're from, Nishoku-chan, but leave that man to me. I have an interest in him. Sakura would have objected, but she felt her Bunshin disappear and dashed back to face Kin and Zaku. She looked behind her at the old woman, but only noticed her looking after her with some curiosity. Strange, that she noticed an enemy in danger. Cho said to herself, interesting, and I haven't had anything to do for a while. The old woman turned to Kabuto and smiled slightly. You used to work with my cute grandson, Kabuto-kun. I wasn't really looking for information about him, but this is an interesting change of plans. Sakura didn't bother to listen to any more. She was too busy trying to get a hold of Zuka's arm so she could break it. Apparently Orochimaru had been a very, very busy person while they had lost touch. Jiraiya had to admire the effort that must have gone into this technique. Although, it was faintly disgusting to wonder, just how he had gotten the bodies to do that. Well, he knew now just what had happened to those Kusanin who had disappeared. Too bad Kusa was probably going to be destroyed anyways. He honestly felt bad about that. With summons dismissed, all three Sunin were starting to conserve their energy for what they were considering would be a very long battle. Even with Tsunade's help, Orochimaru was a very clever person and a powerful ninja. He would have been able to perform the attack that he just had. Jiraiya looked at the three coffins in front of him dubiously, but before he could perform a technique needed, Tsunade crashed down from above and broke in one of the coffins as it began to open. Jiraiya, Edo Tensei can be negated if you destroy the coffin before the corpse can get out. Tsunade roared. Edo Tensei, to think he had figured out how to do that. There were few jutsu that were truly forbidden in the world, but Edo Tensei was one of them for the simple reason that to perform it, another life had to be sacrificed. Most techniques, even the forbidden ones, were only called that because they demanded so much control or chakra, that it would kill most people who tried it. That was one of the very, very few that were considered morally wrong by people. That and the Shinigami would usually get really, really mad when people started messing with his realm, and he had a tendency to do little nasties to people who tried. Jiraiya could remember reading about some incident when he had personally appeared, brought the person in question back to life for real just so that they would kill their would-be master. The Shinigami seemed to be of the philosophy that eventually everyone would die anyways, so why not allow someone to go back every so often? It wasn't like they weren't going to die again. Still trying to find ways around dying, I see, Jiraiya muttered, Ranjishigami no Jutsu. Jiraiya's hair lashed out and circled around the remaining coffins, destroying them, and he was nearly impaled by the suddenly sharp tongue that tried to stab him in the back. It was hard to tell if Orochimaru had done that on purpose or was just mad that one of his many trump cards had been made useless. So, for old time's sake, Jiraiya asked, what's the point of this invasion? I know you don't really have revenge as a motive. What, were you bored or something? Orochimaru snickered. No, Jiraiya, I just need some new bodies. He said conversationally. There is a technique that I've nearly finished, and I want someone who has control over the Sharingan. Jiraiya had heard rumors of this from his spy network. Orochimaru had, through some kind of unholy research, been trying to find a way to transfer his soul from one body to another. That thought alone was enough to turn his stomach, but what was worse was that he would gain the ability of the body he had taken. Permanently. So you hadn't finished it, that was interesting, his sources had said that he had. Oh, I finished it, Orochimaru snarled, anger suddenly appearing on his face, but Uchiha Itachi managed to use some kind of genjutsu to block my mind. So he had joined with Akatsuki. His sources had been a little vague on that part. Is death such a horrible thing that you would stoop this low? Tsunade asked, a sneer on her face. A strange look appeared over Orochimaru's face. I refuse to be reborn, Tsunade-hime. I will not cease to exist. Orochimaru's tongue shot out, aiming for Tsunade, who jumped a little out of the way, and grabbed the tongue. Jiraiya had to wince from the pain that Orochimaru must have felt from being yanked, by the tongue, towards a woman who was about to pound you until there was nothing left to pound. Orochimaru seemed to be trying to brace himself, but Jiraiya decided to lend a hand. His hair shot out and wrapped around Orochimaru's throat just as Tsunade landed a punch to the stomach. Blood came out of this mouth, and for a moment all three stood still. Jiraiya. The voice was more of a strangled hiss than anything else. Kill me, Jiraiya, do it now. The river was now completely frozen over, and it was a wonderful place for a battle. At least, from Haku's point of view. Doso didn't seem to appreciate having an enemy who would sink into the ice and pop up at random places. Haku had been working for a long time on this technique, as it was more of a modification of his Hihutsu, Makyu Hyushao, than anything else. It had been a little worrisome to do it over such a large area. Even now, he could only manage about 20 or so feet of ice, and it looked like Doso was starting to figure it out. Haku appeared, throwing Senbon at him, and diving back into the ice. Doso made a sweet tune with the melody arm and cursed when he missed his target and managed to get a Senbon in the shoulder. He had already tried to break the ice with little success, but his attacks were actually starting to wear away at it. Haku hoped that he hadn't noticed this yet. You know, this is unnecessary, Doso said. Orochimaru-sama is actually interested in your power. If you surrendered now, you'd probably be welcome. And why would my friends and I want to join him? Haku was genuinely confused. What did the Snake Sunin have to offer him? To meet your goals. All of you have things that you want. Orochimaru-sama can help you reach those goals, Doso said, still prepared to fight. He had promised to heal my face. Kin and Zuka were both from minor villages that were wiped out, and they've achieved their hopes from gaining more power to avenge their families. I don't know what your goals are, but if you stop fighting us and join with us, you'll be one step closer to your goal. Haku was silent as he considered, but this Orochimaru is standing in the way of our goal. My friends wish to reclaim Konoha, but your presence has made it that much harder. You speak of what your friends want, but what about you? I wish to help my friends, Haku said after a while, and I wish to eventually have a family. But if with my death, I can help my friends achieve their goal, I will be happy. I have no interest in getting more powerful unless I need to. Well, Kabuto can't say anything else, Doso muttered, and the melody arm swept the ice beneath Haku's feet. The ice, which had been pretty much unbreakable while Haku had been in it, cracked and broke easily. Thought so. Haku winced a little bit. That was a one-time only attack, and he had just been set at a large disadvantage. Well, he had found out the reason for this guy's interest in them, and he supposed that it was time to stop playing with experimental jutsu and to beat him. Besides, He had the information that he needed. Sakura might need help. It was then that there was a surge of water and something jumped out, causing both Haku and Doso to jump back and ready their weapons as the girl jumped onto the bridge. She didn't wear bandages anymore, and was now wearing something that looked something like a black shirt and pants that were both very tight. Tight enough to make Haku blush slightly. She still had scales along her face and arms, but it seemed more even and less patchy. Doso didn't wait for an introduction. He aimed his arm towards her and sent a pulse of sound towards her. Isaribi jumped into the water and right behind him, sending a kick that Haku took advantage of. Senbon lodged themselves in strategic places and another kick sent him into the water. You could have defeated him before I came, Isaribi said, looking down. I wanted to know what he wanted, Haku said. Do you think we should get him out? Haku didn't need to have his question answered. Dosu had already managed to jump up, clutching his melody arm, which had Senbon in and would have lost all feeling by now, and was panting slightly. So there were more of you, he muttered. You're not a group of missing nin, are you? Haku shook his head. I suppose in some ways we are, and in others we're not, he said with something like a shrug. At any rate, I'm sorry, but could you please surrender now? I really am in a hurry, and I don't want to kill you. Fighting would just take longer. Doso didn't move. Have it your way then, Haku sighed. The battle would be over shortly. It was the end of the Yamanaka clan. Ino clutched her younger cousins, Ai and Hoshi, as close as she could as she sat with her head down under the genjutsu that her parents had made to cover them and realized this fact. She hadn't been told anything until that morning when her father had set up the genjutsu around the flower shop and said that he would come and get her. They had a code that they had worked out when Ino was just a little girl, and that would be used in case there was an imposter. Ino hadn't argued. It wasn't her job to fight her parents. Particularly when it seemed they'd been planning this for a while. Ino did wish that they hadn't though. She might have been a ninja, but it seemed that she wasn't considered to be a strong enough fighter to do anything that wasn't looking after her cousins. Well, given her pathetic performance at the exams, that was understandable, Ino had thought as she watched her cousins play and listened for the sounds of a battle of some kind. Actually, the whole thing hadn't been much of a surprise to Ino. She knew her parents actively were against the Hokage. She knew that they had spoken against him. She knew that, given the chance, they would have rebelled, and this was just the chance they had wanted. She just hoped they knew what they were doing. In the academy, Ino hadn't listened to most of the lectures. There had been magazines to read, girls to compare herself to, boys to check out, and flowers to read about, but she had understood one thing: no one went against the Godame and lived. She still remembered what had happened to Iwa when Uchiha Sasuke and some other kids, including Sakura, a shy girl who Ino had wanted to talk to, had been kidnapped. The war had been brutal. Not that Iwa hadn't deserved it. Sasuke had been the only good-looking boy around. Even Uzumaki Naruto, the loud-mouthed bratty kid who her mother and father had always warned her not to get too close to since he had been born in the Kyuubi attack and might have some unstable chakra, had been better than most people. And that was just sad. Still, the fact that the Godame was a man who held a great deal of power had stayed with Ino, and while she, like most ninja her age, agreed with her parents, she also felt that they shouldn't let him know. After all, defying the Godame was like defying gravity. You could do it for a while, but eventually it would pull you back down, and if you had really tried, it would kill you. The sight of Root running around, attacking anything that moved, and trying to keep her cousins quiet wasn't anything that Ino hadn't expected. The fear in her stomach was also something that she wasn't surprised by. It was a horrible thing to know that you weren't going to see your family again. While this was going through her mind, something moved at the door. Ino. It was her father's voice. Ino, open up, princess. She knew that it was Root. Her father had never called her princess in private. He had had a less flattering nickname for her from when she was a little toddler who was rather overweight. She had pleaded with him not to refer to her as Bonebone ever outside the house, but there was nothing she could do about it home. Inoichi had seemed to take pleasure in it, and after a while, it was a sort of code. Since only the immediate family knew anything about it, it was perfect. And now she knew that father was probably dead. Ino hugged her cousins closer to her and closed her eyes, trying not to cry herself. Ino. Her father's voice called, open dash. But his voice was cut off with a sharp cry in another, almost alien one. Something black snaked into the room, and Ino prepared herself for whatever was happening. Should she surrender? Maybe if she did, her cousins would live. Probably not. Get behind me, Ino hissed, drawing a kunao as the black shape began to take form. Into Hideaki. He was wearing what looked like a cheap pun of the Yondame's Haori and a very big grin on his face. There was also a mask that had been pushed up so that Ino could see him. His eyes took in Ino and her cousins, and the grin remained. Hello, Miss Gorgeous. Or do you like Bone better? Sakura-chan usually dislikes nicknames that have to do with food, but that could just be her. Sasuke performed a very complicated stunt that he probably wouldn't have been able to repeat if his life depended on it, which it might soon, to avoid the whip that seemed to be almost everywhere now. The stunt involved a handspring, jump back, hop on one foot to the side and twisting his body in a way that didn't seem possible. Having only used the Sharingan once before, Sasuke was not as skilled as Yumi was. If he lived, he would talk to Jiraiya about investing in a sword. He was a short-range fighter, and honestly, he needed something to help him. He didn't care anymore that Naruto didn't need one. Besides, maybe if he had one he could wipe that smug look off of his face in a training session that focused on hand-to-hand combat. Katon, Hozenka. Sasuke said and blew a series of small fireballs towards Yumi, but she moved quickly, only slightly singeing the sleeve of her uniform. Yumi's whip suddenly wrapped around Sasuke from behind, pinning his arms together. Sasuke struggled, wide-eyed, but wasn't able to move or get out of the binding. Katon, Ryuka no Jutsu, Yumi said, a small smile on her face as she watched his eyes light in recognition of the attack. The flames rushed down the rope, engulfing Sasuke immediately. He didn't even have time to scream. Yumi's smile widened, but froze when the fire ceased to reveal a charred log. Kyuso, she muttered, her eyes narrowed and her mouth set. So that's what you look like, angry. Now let's try a look of fear. Sasuke's voice seemed to come from nowhere as the shuriken flew towards Yumi. She dodged easily, but had to dodge again to avoid them when they came back around. Sa shuriken no jutsu, you're rather well versed in Uchiha jutsu, Yumi remarked, as Sasuke jumped down. He was panting a little bit. Sorry, I didn't know you have it trademarked, Sasuke sneered, irritated with the fact that he had so exclusively studied the scroll attack he had given him. The whip came from nowhere from behind, and Sasuke was only warned of it a second before it hit. While he managed to not get impaled, he saw that it was going to wrap around and go for his face. Sasuke leaned back but misjudged the distance, and a crack appeared in the mask. Now that your stupid mask is gone. Yumi muttered, I want to see, what? As the mask fell down, it revealed the crimson of the Sharingan. The whip fell flat. The rest of the mask fell to reveal Sasuke's full face. It was wearing a very ugly look in a cross between a glare and a smirk. He was amused at her shock that she could be fighting an Uchiha, worried that now the world would probably know who he was, and annoyed that he had broken his nice mask, which was brand new, and he was going to have to ask Jiraiya to make him another one and listen to his renditions about how useful masks were. Uchiha. Yumi was obviously confused for the first time, but the only Uchiha who would have been your age. Katon, Gokakyu no Jutsu. Sasuke yelled, aiming the fireball towards her. Alright, fine, Sasuke found himself thinking. Forget all attempts at hiding who he was. He dashed forwards, throwing 3 kunao and taking out the Fuma shuriken that was carefully folded up inside of his Haori and concealed. He shook it and it clicked into alignment as he threw it at Yumi as she jumped to avoid the Gokakyu. The whip whirled around from nowhere and wrapped around Sasuke, this time not harming him, and the shuriken went spinning off into nowhere. Uchiha Sasuke, Yumi said, looking him over, you've grown from the 7-year-old who was constantly following that man around saying, Anarchy, Anarchy. I suppose you either were taken from IWA by something else or sold as a slave. Your mother will be pleased to see you. Sasuke tested the rope holding him. No, there wasn't a weakness. Don't bother. You're coming home with me, and we'll see what this foolishness about blood feuds is about, and who fed you lies. Kyuso. Sasuke cursed, struggling slightly. It was then that everything changed. One moment, Sasuke was struggling against his bonds, and the next something black had jumped next to him, cut through the whip that was holding Sasuke captive, and he was standing in the audience's seat. "Go to your friends, Sasuke," the figure said, calmly pressing his forehead with 2 fingers, "they need you." Uchiha Yumi stared with rage at the newcomer, and she took an involuntary step forwards, forgetting everything else but him. "You," she said, her eyes focusing on Uchiha Itachi. Naruto and Sora had basically forgotten about using jutsu. Both were attacking one another with all the ferocity that they could manage without completely losing themselves to the power that was trying to take them over. Naruto was vaguely aware that he seemed to have 2 tails, but he was more interested in not listening to the voice that was going on in his head, telling him calmly that the only way to win was to kill Sora, and do it now. Kyuubi was actually offended that someone had had the audacity to use his chakra against him. Sora and Naruto both jumped forwards, clawing, biting, kicking, and throwing punches left and right. Finally, Naruto started to slowly stand up. "This isn't getting anywhere," he huffed. "So, you surrender?" Sora huffed back. "You're thicker than I am," Naruto growled. The redness around him started to fade slightly, but then it felt like Naruto had been hit on the head and he fell. The only sound was the sound of dripping water. "So you've returned, my despicable host," a voice said, and Naruto looked up into the eyes of the monster that had haunted his nightmares for nearly 5 years. He looked the same, and the intent was the same. Naruto could feel the promise of complete destruction pulsing from the creature as it looked at him, but he refused to run away in terror again. "You look as ugly as you did last time," Naruto said. Brave words for a child who reeks of terror. Naruto clenched his teeth, knowing that the thing was right. He had to calm down, or he would probably get suckered into doing something incredibly stupid. "You know, dragging me here was kind of stupid. After all, if Sora kills me, you go down with me," Naruto said conversationally, in a way that he had seen Neji act when he had an indisputable argument. The Kyuubi snarled in a single pull, ran against the cage, the claws making a scratching sound against the metal. "So, you demand my power?" it asked. "Nope," Naruto crossed his arms, "I want you to stop pushing it at me in this battle. I can fight Sora on my own." "Then would you like to make a little wager?" Kyuubi asked. "If you defeat Sora, I will give you a small part of my power when you tell me to, and if you fail, you will allow me to do it myself." "All right," Naruto's eyes widened and he put one hand to his mouth. The response had been out before he could even think. He glared at the Kyuubi. "I didn't agree to that," he hissed. "Your body did." "Oh, and I will tell you this, because Sora shares chakra with me, I have influence on him just as I have on you. The only difference is that you have built up a resistance to me. I will be putting enough of my power into Sora to make him interesting. I'll enjoy seeing just how much of a fight you can put up against me." Naruto suddenly felt himself being yanked hard from behind and cursed as he heard the soft laughter from inside the cage. Naruto almost lost his head before he saw the claw coming towards him, but he jumped backwards, suddenly feeling exhausted. So, the Kyuubi had suddenly removed all his power other than the things that were just going to happen, like the whole healing thing and his chakra reserves. While the red cloak around him was quickly disappearing, the one around Sora was starting to grow thicker and a third tail was appearing. Naruto cursed and made some more cage bunshin. He needed to hurry. From what little he could see, the more tails appeared, the more dangerous, and Kyuubi would cheat if he had the chance. Even if that wasn't really him, Kyuubi probably wouldn't mind having a 6-tailed fox running around wreaking havoc on Konoha. Hihutsu, Mushidama. Naruto whirled around halfway just in time to see the bugs rush past him and congeal around Sora's form. A burst of chakra separated the shape and they flew backwards to the form that had stepped out from behind a tree. "It always disturbed me how you treated your inferiors and enemies, Sora-san," Shino said softly, stepping forwards. "Hello Taki, though I would prefer to call my ally by his proper name, Naruto." Hinata was shocked as her younger sister embraced her, sobbing and laughing at the same time. "I knew you'd come back. I knew that you'd take me with you," she kept saying over and over while she hugged Hinata. Honestly, Hinata hadn't been all that close to her younger sister. It hadn't been out of cruelty or dislike on either side. It was just that Hinata hadn't been able to hide her fear and disgust for clan matters, and Hanabi, even at a very early age, had been able to act like it didn't bother her, or at least to bottle up the emotions. Also, Hanabi was being trained personally by their father while Hinata worked alone. The times they had met had been highly formal and usually with the whole clan around them. Maybe they were afraid that one would kill the other. After all, Hinata might be overlooked in favor of Hanabi because of Hinata's lack of power, but Hanabi might also be overlooked in favor of Hinata for tradition's sake. It had never much occurred to Hinata that Hanabi had looked up to her, or that her absence had been missed. "Hanabi, it's all right, I'm sorry I kept you waiting," Hinata said, not sure what to say. She glanced over at Niji, but she couldn't tell what he was doing behind the mask, probably looking awkward. He wasn't really good with the rest of the Hyuga clan, and Hinata distinctly remembered him referring to Hanabi as a brat. Hanabi seemed to notice Niji for the first time as well, but didn't hug him the same way. "Niji and I-san," she said happily, "most of the clan thought that you would go off on your own, but I didn't think so." Both Niji and Hinata looked at each other in surprise. "Hanabi-sama," Niji said, reverting to his more familiar term of addressing her, "what's going on? Is there a civil war going on between the Hyuga on top of the invasion?" Hanabi shrugged, "I guess so. We were at the arena, watching the exams when it started, but when the fighting started, half the clan turned against Otasama. He told me to run, and to find safety. It sounds like the branch house took the opportunity presented to them to try to rebel," Niji said, crossing his arms and tilting his head a little. Hanabi sniffed a little bit. "Otasama, do you think he's alive, Nei-san?" She looked so upset that there wasn't anything that Hinata could do but tell her she did. "Otasama was the most powerful fighter in the Hyuga clan," she said. "Is there somewhere you were supposed to meet him?" "No, but whatever Hanabi was going to say was interrupted by a very loud explosion and lots of gas. Everyone, including Hanabi, jumped to the defensive. "Halt evildoers, and cower before my awesome skills. Warwick no dash." "Oh no, not again," Niji said, sending a punch to the figure and making it explode back. "I am never going to see that disgusting display again after the first time." Hinata couldn't help the giggle from escaping. It was a really funny story. The figure fell back and the smoke cleared to reveal a boy about Hanabi's age with his brown hair tied back. "Kano Amaru?" Hanabi asked, looking incredulous. "Isn't that the kid that Naruto said was following him around?" Niji hissed to Hinata, who shrugged. "I think so," she said. "I don't remember a name." Hinata walked over to the fallen boy and carefully picked him up. "Would you please tell me what you were doing?" she asked sweetly. "You're attacking Hanabi. I'm going to beat you and then I'm going to repel all the invaders with the awesome jutsu that Taiki-san gave me." Kano Amara yelled, making a few swings at Hinata and missing since she was out of his arm's reach. "Kano Amaru, stop it," Hanabi said in a flat, dull voice. "You're just making yourself look stupider than you are." Hey coughed a little bit. "This is interesting, everyone, but aren't we needed in another part of the town? If the Hyuga clan's internal problems are also coming to a head, we should leave them to fight amongst themselves." Hinata opened her mouth but closed it. "All right," she said. "Hanabi, could you bring Kano Amaru and come with us?" she asked, looking at the figure which was now a rock and sighed. "Naruto really shouldn't have trained him. And he's gone." Hanabi signed. "That idiot, he's going to go get help or something." "We're not going to be there when he comes back," Hate said, taking on an air of command that Hinata hadn't known he had. "Kano Amaru should be fine, and the Hyuga situation needs to be reported." Hinata nodded, keeping one hand on Hanabi's shoulder. "I'll take you to meet my new friends, Hanabi-chan," Hinata said with a smile. "They're a little strange sometimes, but they're very nice." "It's interesting how you keep yourself out of that statement," Niji muttered. "Asa Kyojaku!" Guy shouted as he attacked, feeling the sixth gate opening up. Beiki wasn't able to dodge, and was thrown to the ground under the rain of fire and punches. "Ha! See how the power of youth crushes all who do evil," Guy said, giving a thumbs up to the world and allowing his teeth to sparkle. He had won, and without having to open the other gates. Beiki started to move, and Guy's hopes of being done and making it to his cute students quickly was disappointed. He raised his fists and prepared himself to open the last 2 gates. This was going to have to end quickly. The opening of the gates was a painful process, and one that Guy didn't like to do often. For one thing, it could eventually shorten his lifespan, and he wanted very much to see his students promoted to high rankings. He had always wanted to have children, and he saw his students, particularly Lee, to be a sort of substitute for the children he never had, and like any father, he wanted to live to see them succeed. The 7th gate was open. "You're better than I thought you were," Beiki huffed. "To manage to dodge my Kaze no Yaiba is pretty impressive." Guy grinned. "I am in the springtime of my youth. Nothing shall stop me." Beiki smirked slightly. "We'll see." The 8th gate was open. "Kaze no Yaiba, Shippuden. Yuakokuraiwa." Both attacks were shouted as loud as possible, but after that there was silence. The hurricane wind died down and the roar of the attack known as the Evening Dragon faded, leaving nothing but echoes and a few leaves driven by the wind. Check the description for the links to the author.